Preparation for David's lesson, I'm going to read from 1 Corinthians 10, 12, and 13. So if you think you're standing firm, be careful you do not fall. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. Praise God for that. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. Brother Dave?
You may be seated. Looks like that slide may have advanced itself or something. Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, all right. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I was just listening. I wasn't looking at the screen. So, yes, it's been an amazing week, and so many people served so greatly this week, and we thank every single one of them. I had several visitors from the community, and it was good for them, and I was thankful to see them. As been mentioned, we have a nice new pulpit here, which is a beautiful thing. It does hide your knees, though, if they're kind of shaking. So that's a drawback, I guess, but that's going to serve us well for a long time. So thankful to David Personic and Leslie for providing for us. David made it. It's beautiful indeed. So several elderly nuns were on the second floor of their convent when a fire broke out one night. And when they realized their exit was blocked by the fire, they took off their habits and they tied them together and they made them into a rope and they climbed out the window from the second floor and made it safely to the ground. Well, a news reporter came up to one of the nuns afterward and said, "Weren't you afraid that the habits would have ripped or broke since they're old?" And the nun replied, "Not at all. Don't you know that old habits are hard to break?" Oh, yeah. Old habit. How many of us, though, would attest to the fact that our experience is old habits are indeed hard to break? Wouldn't it be great if suddenly, instantly, we could just become spiritually mature, completely perfect? Imagine how different this world would be. Imagine how different this church would be if the second every one of us were baptized, we immediately were made morally flawless and spiritually wise. Just like that. Wouldn't it be great? We'd have no more struggles with impatience or with greed or with lust or selfishness. There'd no longer be complaining or gossiping or lying. Wouldn't it be great if the instant we became a Christian, we'd be a model of flawless integrity? Wouldn't that be great? So much for fantasy. Now let's come back to reality. Alan Redpath wrote, "The conversion of the soul is the miracle of the moment, but the making of a saint is the task of a lifetime." When we become Christians, we do receive a new nature. We are made into new creations, but that doesn't mean we've escaped the influence of the old self, the old nature, right? When we become Christians, we receive the Spirit of God. He lives in us, and His mission is to transform us. And that's great news. This gives us new power over sin. Sin no longer has to be our master then. But even as the Spirit continues to help us become more and more like Christ, we must keep in mind we are still 100% human. We still have the flesh. As we move forward in our Christian life, Satan and sin will continue to stalk us, right? We'll struggle with old temptations. We'll sometimes fall back into familiar sinful patterns. And even some faithful people will sometimes abandon their faith, become temporarily faithless. And those of us who've been Christians for a while, we can attest to these kinds of things. We can share experiences ourselves of having failing faith at times or repeated struggles with old sins. And guess what? When it comes to Abraham and his journey of faith, we shouldn't be surprised to find that he is just like us and we are just like him. And so in today's episode from Abraham's journey, we will witness his fall into an old sinful pattern. Charles Swindoll calls it Disobedience Deja Vu. I thought that's a good title. Disobedience Deja Vu. Genesis 20 and verse 1 begins. Now Abraham moved on from there into the region of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. For a while he stayed in Gerar, and there Abraham said of his wife, Sarah, she is my sister. Then Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for Sarah and took her. Now Yogi Berra, the famous baseball player, was credited to saying, it's deja vu all over again. That's one of those Berrisms, right? You may remember 25 years earlier, Abraham did this same thing, right? He moved down to Egypt, and he said of his wife, Sarah, she is my sister. And the king of Egypt, Pharaoh himself, took her to be a wife. Now, why has Abraham gone down to the Negev this time? It's not the same place as Egypt, but it is south of where he'd been living. My guess is he wanted to escape the devastation of the cities of the plain. He didn't want to look at that devastation all the time. So he wanted some new sight, some new vista. So he heads down in that direction. Why did he lie about Sarah? Well, he lied because she's a lovely woman. He feared that if he said, she's my wife, someone will kill him, make her a widow, so that they can marry her. Now, when he told this lie back in Genesis 12, Sarah was 65 years old. When he tells the lie here in Genesis 20, Sarah is almost 90 years old. She had reached the age which for most of us, if we make it there, means lots of wrinkles, gray hair, a crippled body, and yet she's still so stunning and desirable that Abimelech, the king of Gerar, wanted her for a wife. So Abraham's fears in that sense are not unfounded or not far-fetched. Just like last time, Abraham was now in deep trouble, right? Sarah's honor is at stake. God's plan is in jeopardy. King Abimelech is on the verge of unknowingly committing a grievous moral transgression, what we call adultery, right? And as I mentioned in the sermon back on Genesis 12, it was customary for a woman who was to become a wife to be put in seclusion for a while. So Sarah at this point is kept from any man, including the king, as she awaits for the wedding. The story continues in verse 3. But God came to Abimelech in a dream one night and said to him, you are as good as dead, because the woman you have taken, she is a married woman. Now Abimelech had not gone near her, so he said to the Lord, Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation? Did he not say to me, she is my sister? And didn't she also say, he is my brother? I have done this with a clear conscience and clean hands. Then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know you did this with a clear conscience, so I have kept you from sinning against me. And that's why I did not let you touch her. Now return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you will live. But if you do not return her, you may be sure that you and all yours will die. Now, what are two of the most sweetest words in all the Bible? And two of the most sweetest words in all the Bible are, but God, right? But God. When God sent the flood on the earth, and flood waters covered the earth for 150 days, the Bible tells us, but God remembered Noah, right? And then there's other great but gods. Paul wrote, we were harassed at every turn, conflicts on the outside, fears within, but God who comforts the downcast comforted us. We were in a terrible place, but God helped us. Another passage, Paul said, we were dead in our transgressions. We were by nature objects of wrath, but God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ. Ephesians 2, 1 through 5. Excuse me. So here we are today. In this situation, Abraham's got himself into a mess, and yet God comes through, right? But God. God intervened on Abraham's behalf, and that's the only way Abraham would have escaped this predicament. You see, God had made a promise to Abraham, and it's a promise that God had to keep. He had told Abraham that Sarah would have Abraham's child in about a year, right? From the time God said it. And so God intervened to preserve his own integrity. 2 Timothy 2:13 says, if we are faithless, he will remain faithful, for he cannot disown himself. Abraham was faithless, but God remained faithful to his promise. Therefore, God rescued both Abraham and Sarah so they could have the son of promise. So, as King Abimelech slept that night, whichever night it was, however many nights after he had taken Sarah into his harem, the Lord invaded his dreams. And God basically told Abimelech, you are a dead man, because you have taken a woman who's already married. And Abimelech, like Pharaoh in the first instant, he didn't believe in the one true God, right? He believed in many, many gods. And yet, he had the integrity enough to honor another man's marriage. We must keep in mind some people who don't worship God are people of integrity. There are moral people out there who aren't followers of God. And candidly, some non-believers have more integrity than some believers at times, which is not a good thing. And in this case, Abimelech behaved more righteously than Abraham did. So Abimelech pleaded his case in response to God, right? I'm innocent. Abraham said she was a sister, and she said he was a brother. And yet the Lord uses this failure on Abraham's part as an opportunity to reach out to this pagan king, to capture his heart. So God said to Abimelech, I know you're innocent. That's why I kept you from sinning. Now return the woman. He will pray for you, for he is a prophet. Now the interesting thing is this is the first time the word prophet is used in the Bible. Genesis is a book of beginnings, right? It's the first time in the Bible the word prophet is used. And how surprisingly that Abraham would be the one who is first called a prophet. Even though he's the one who had just reverted to his old sinful pattern of lying to keep himself from harm. This should encourage us when we realize we serve a faithful God who can and will work through or around our own weaknesses, our own faults. God will accomplish his purposes. Sometimes he'll use our failures to do so. And so there's an amazing irony in this episode, right? Imagine Abimelech having been surprised when God called Abraham a prophet, because this is a guy who had just lied to save his own skin. Nevertheless, God upholds Abraham's role as a divine intermediary and told Abimelech that Abraham's going to pray for you and you will live. And Abimelech probably is thinking, we should pray for Abraham so he can live, right? What do you mean he's going to pray for me? Interestingly enough, Abraham, trying to protect himself, gave God more work to do than if Abraham had just trusted God in the first place. Think about that. How many times do we do that, right? Make more work for God because we're not walking closely enough with him. The story continues. Verse 8, early the next morning, Abimelech summoned all his officials. When he told them all that had happened, they were very much afraid. Yeah, when God shows up and tells you you're all going to die, that's kind of scary. Then Abimelech called Abraham in and said, what have you done to us? How have I wronged you that you brought such great guilt upon me and my kingdom? You've done things to me that should not be done. And Abimelech asked Abraham, what was your reason for doing this? And Abraham replied, I said to myself, there is surely no fear of God in this place. They will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother. She became my wife. And when God made me wander through my father's household, I said to her, or from my father's household, I said to her, this is how you can show your love to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, he is my brother. So Abimelech has every right to be enraged, right? Every right to be offended. He had done nothing to harm Abraham, yet Abraham placed him and his kingdom in great danger. So Abimelech demanded to know the reason. Give me an explanation. And Abraham was forced to explain. And his explanation was pathetic, but at least it was honest, right? Abraham began with an insult. I'm not sure he saw it as an insult, but it was an insult. He basically said, I lied because you're an irreligious people, and you're a murderous people. There's no fear of God in this place, and you're going to kill me. How's that for winning friends and influencing people? Not so good, right? Abraham had made this blind assumption about Abimelech and his subjects, and he let his imagination run wild to the worst scenario. They're surely going to kill me. Then Abraham justified his lie by saying, it's really not a big lie, it's just a little one. It's a half-truth. She is my half-sister. Oh, of course, she's also my wife, but she is my half-sister, so it's not really a lie, is it? But this was he and his wife's SOP, standard operating procedure, right? He had said this was the way we show we love each other. We say, you're my brother and you're my sister. What's even worse, though, is Abraham apparently didn't see how this lie undermined his testimony about God. Abraham's saying, basically, I follow the one true God, but I don't trust him enough to protect me, so I lie to protect myself. You see the problem with that? If you trust in the one true God, you don't have to lie to protect yourself. You trust in God. But isn't it sad how our rationalizations become so familiar to us, we're blinded by how absurd they sound? That's where Abraham was. The story concludes in a surprising way. Then Abimelech brought sheep and cattle and males and female slaves and gave them to Abraham. He returned Sarah, his wife, to him. And Abimelech said, my land is before you. Live wherever you like. And to Sarah he said, I am giving your brother 1,000 shekels of silver. This is to cover the offense against you before all who are with you. You are completely vindicated. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife and his slave girls so that they could have children again, for the Lord had closed up every womb in Abimelech's household because of Abraham's wife, Sarah. So again, as I said, Abimelech had every right to be enraged and offended, and yet here we see him being forgiving and giving, right? Forgiving and giving. I might have been inclined to say, get this foolish guy out of my sight. He and his wife get out of my country. But that's not what Abimelech did he? Now, he knew the one true God had Abraham's back, so maybe he was trying to be a little nice because of that, right? He doesn't want God to be upset with him. God had said, I'll take you out if you mistreat Abraham, right? So Abimelech gave him permission to remain in the country, settle wherever he wanted. He returned Sarah to Abraham and couldn't resist throwing in that little zinger. Did you notice it? When he addressed Abraham as her brother. And say, I'm giving your husband these things. He says, I'm giving your brother these things. Jab, 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 right? And by giving the money to Abraham, Abimelech was trying to compensate for any wrong, to prove that the marriage had not been consummated, restoring Sarah's honor and reputation, removing any suspicion. Now Abraham, hopefully feeling suitably shamed by all of this, responded by interceding for the king. And God heard and responded to Abraham's prayer and healed Abimelech, his wife, and his slave girls. Now, there are many lessons I think we can learn from this episode in Abraham's journey of faith. Charles Swindoll summarized the chapter on Abraham's life with 3 nevers. So let me give you his 3 quick nevers. I think they're good. Number 1, never presume on your own weaknesses. Deep inside of Abraham was this weakness for lying as a way to get out of tight spots, to protect himself. And apparently it was a family trait. Maybe he had seen his own parents or grandparents do it. But he passes it on to his son Isaac, who passes it on to his son Jacob. This is not a good thing to be passing on, right? Now, Abraham should have considered his weakness when he decided to leave where he was and to go down to the Negev, right? There were all kinds of places he could have gone where he might have felt more safe. And had he chosen those places, he might not have felt the need to lie. And yet, he didn't think about that, right? If any one of us is an alcoholic, it's not a good idea to get an apartment above the bar, right? Or right next door, or right across the street. That's common sense. That's not presuming on our weaknesses, right? If any of us is a shopaholic, it's best that we not go to the mall or not carry a credit card. If any of us is attracted to someone other than our spouse or tempted by pornography, then we should make every effort to stay away from those temptations, right? We need a proper fear of our own weaknesses. We need to accept our own vulnerabilities and make a plan to help us overcome them. And we need not do this only when we're young. We need to do this when we're old. See, here's Abraham, and he's 100 years old, soon to be 100 years old, and he's still struggling with the same old sinful patterns. This should help us realize a sobering fact: there will never be a time when we will be beyond failing. There's never going to be an age where we're not going to be prone to sin anymore. It's going to be with us. We have to be vigilant. Never presume on your own weaknesses. A second never. Never rely on your own crutches. When Abraham suggested they lie for protection, Sarah should not have cooperated. She should have said something to him like, Abraham, I love you too much to lie. We're not going to do that as a couple. We're going to trust in God instead, right? Somebody's got to say it. We don't need the crutch. We have a God. We need to get rid of our well-worn crutches, whatever they are, whatever excuses, whatever rationalizations, whatever things we think we need. And that may mean repenting, asking for God's strength to get beyond it. It may mean seeking help of others who can offer assistance or accountability. That can make a difference. And then number 3, Swindoll suggests never lean on your own understanding. Of course, that's a good one right out of Proverbs 3, right? Abraham had a sharp mind, but he allowed it to work against him. And if we're not careful, we'll be tempted to devise all kinds of creative ways to solve our problems or to meet our needs and avoid depending on God to do it. That's what our brains can do. Of course, that's what Satan wants to tempt us to do, right? Rather than facing the possibility that God might let us down or that God might not give us the thing that we want, we're tempted to arrange our own path to personal satisfaction, which employs sinful or ungodly means to get what we want, no matter whether God would like it or not. And the longer we do that, the more they become a habit, the more they become a routine, our SOP, right? And this chronic dependence on self, as opposed to living in faith with God, leads to heartache and eventually spiritual death when we don't live a life that depends on God but depends on ourselves and our sinful ways. We know where that's going to lead. I want to close with the story of Robert Robinson. Robert Robinson grew up in the wild streets of London back in the 18th century, born in 1735. He'd seen many of his friends die violently and young, and he just had always thought, I'm going to die young also. But he decided if he was going to avoid an early death, he had to change his ways. So he started going to church and listening to a Methodist preacher named George Whitefield. He felt his sins were so grievous, though, and so terrible that God would never accept him. And so for 3 years he suffered the deep dread of God's punishment. He didn't turn to God because he didn't think God would welcome him. It wasn't until sometime after his 20th birthday that Robert Robinson made peace with God and gave his life to Christ. With his heart on fire, he prepared to be a minister, became a Methodist minister, began preaching all around London. In 1757, 2 years after his conversion, Robert Robinson wrote a hymn that's still sung in churches today. Perhaps it's one of your favorites. The hymn begins, "Come, thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy grace. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise." What a great line. There's another line in there, that song, that's memorable. It's a fear that every Christian has felt at one time or another. And the line is this: "Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love." Prone to wander. Do you ever feel it? Do you ever feel that tug? And yet he says, "Take my heart, O take and seal it for thy courts above." Prone to wander. Can you relate to it? This was the anxious cry of Robert Robinson's heart, and for a time after writing that hymn, he did wander. He left his ministry. He left the Lord. And he lived for a period of time as an unbeliever. One day, years later, Robert Robinson happened to be sharing a coach with a young woman. And as they were rolling along the streets of London, suddenly she began to hum a familiar tune. And he said to her, "Young lady, do you know the words to that song?" And she said, "Absolutely." And she began with, "Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love." She said, "Do you know that song?" He said, "Know it. I wrote it." And then he said, "But that was so long ago. And I would give 1,000 worlds if I possessed them to have that same love for God that I had back then." History records that that coach ride with that woman was the turning point again in Robinson's life. He later went back to the pulpit, declaring his faith with a renewed passion and confidence, and continued faithfully to his death in June of 1790. Truth is, old habits are hard to break. Truth is, our hearts are sometimes prone to wander and leave the God we love. But the message of the Bible and the message of Abraham's life is that our God is a forgiving God who picks us up when we fall, who welcomes us back when we have wandered. So if today you find yourself fallen or wandering, know that God is ready to pick you up, to welcome you back.